everybody. I have my next guest here with me, Dwight Hurst, and I'm super excited for Dwight to be the sixth speaker on the US and Canada Meant to Be Well Summit. And let me share with you a little bit about Dwight. He is coming to us from Utah, United States, and Dwight is a psychotherapist, podcast producer, and writer. He has worked in the mental health field since 1999, including hospitals, residential programs, and outpatient clinics. Dwight works from the perspective that all problems have solutions and collaborates with his patients to solve them together. His practice, Innovate Mental Health Solutions, specializes in trauma, addiction, and a variety of mental health conditions. Dwight describes his podcast, The Broken Brain, as a fun and informative podcast about psychology, mental health, treatment, research, culture, and all things brainy. Welcome, Dwight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Valerie, thank you so much. It's so nice to be invited back. And can I just say what a wonderful conference you've had, and that even just from the design and the graphics and everything to the guests, which is even more important, just wonderful things so far. And I'm so honored to be here.
Oh, thank you so much, Dwight. I really appreciate it. I love talking with you. And I would love for you to tell us about just really really anything that you share. I love everything you talk about. So I was kind of thinking, like, what should I ask Dwight? Because I really love everything. So I wanted to start off with, because I think this is an important topic about trauma and talking about the role it plays on mental health. Can you share with us? Because I think that's an important topic that I think is becoming more talked about, but we don't necessarily always talk about it. There's some stigma associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting how much there still is stigma, even though we understand so much more about trauma. Even though when I just started working in the field, I say even, it's been a while. It's been too long for me to say even, but I noticed when they started using the phrase, and I'm bad with time, was this 10 years ago? Maybe even more. When they started using the phrase trauma informed, that started to be a kind of one of those buzzwords that would get thrown around in trainings. And the idea of what does that mean, I think, was elusive. And unfortunately, sometimes these terms get thrown around. It's like, is there trauma-informed care? Is this agency trauma-informed? Yada, yada. And it's taken a while for people to kind of get to know what that means. I think it means looking at problems through the lens of trauma and kind of assuming that that is probably playing a role in most of the needs that we have. It certainly correlates highly with addiction, but with a lot of different things, just always being aware of it, of what role trauma might play in someone's own mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that is so, because trauma, I feel like, I love definitions, but is there a definition of trauma? Like, I feel like it's kind of subjective almost, but it is so important to be subjective. Talk about it.
Well, that's one of the evolving things that I think is very important in trauma, is that's gone from originally it was always thought of something that was life-threatening. In fact, you go back in time long enough, it was basically wartime was what trauma meant.
Yeah.
And then we got to where we're like, well, I guess it's a life-threatening event. And then we get to where it's, well, I guess some things that don't kill you or might not be able to kill you could still count, like abuse and some of those incidents. And we kind of have gone until you actually hit a very important word, which is subjective, right? Subjectivity of trauma. And now we talk about things in a matter of degrees of trauma. Sometimes you'll hear that phrase, little t trauma, big T trauma, complex trauma, complex PTSD. Instead of saying it's an either or, there's a whole range of where does this come from? We talk about secondary trauma, which used to be something that people would kind of make fun of, the idea that you can be traumatized by dealing with someone else's trauma. One thing I have seen a lot, if we're getting into that kind of core definition, I think trauma is crisis and tragedy, particularly and more complex if it is paired with surprise. the more that you weren't expecting something to happen, the more sudden or jarring it is. Or basically the way there are many things we're not wired to handle, such as abuse and things. That would be why, for example, the death of a child can be often more traumatic and more complex than the death of, say, a very close loved one who's maybe in their late 90s, who dies in a hospital room surrounded by people who love them, very much the way you'd expect. I don't want to say hope, but the way we would hope that maybe we'd go, kind of thing. The surprise or suddenness is sometimes it's jarring, and it violates the basic assumptions we have about our lives.
Yes, yes. I think that, absolutely. And I can just think about how it's almost lives in your brain. And I know that there's some literature out there that talks about that. And there's what's out there to talk to your therapist or practice on if you feel like you have lived through some trauma. What can you do about it? What's the kind of the recommended guidelines at this point in time?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, there's a lot of things, and that's where I'm seeing people getting more and more comfortable with dealing with trauma. And we also have a lot of modern techniques. I was doing a little bit of a deep dive for my podcast a while ago, about cognitive behavioral trauma focused therapy, which that was the preferred as when I was coming into the field. And there was a very specific guideline, right? Of you need to talk about the trauma, you need to journal about it, you need to write down the traumatic event, you need to share it with another person who's not your therapist. You would even write the trauma narrative over and over and over. And frankly, the one size fits all and some of the limitations, it worked great for some people. It didn't work great for some people. And one of the biggest risks of it wasn't that it didn't work, it was that people didn't do it
Mm,
because it's very intimidating. And so if I'm going to have to talk about this, talk about this, talk about this, and all that, right? Then it's intimidating for people to go in. And nowadays it's still around, obviously. There's those approaches, but some of the more modern approaches would be things like EMDR, or eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy.
mhm.
IFS is another one that I'm hearing more and more that I really like, which is internal family systems.
Yeah.
And then we have ART, which I don't know as much about. That I know some therapists training in those, which is a variation off of the EMDR. And also then there's a lot of people just using what you might call somatic techniques, which is body movement coupled with where is your area of focus. And the interesting thing about some of those techniques is that they don't necessarily require people to go ad nauseum into, like, let me tell everything. Basically, you can tell and share the things you are comfortable with, and that may change as you desensitize and it's not as acute. In fact, I mean, according to the experiences and outcomes people have with some of those therapies, there are people who are like, I don't ever want to talk about it, but they'll do the techniques and the exercises, and they experience, similar recovery rates and maybe even more rapid recovery rates than people who do the traditional, write down a big journal and burn the notebook or something, whatever it is that, as people do. So there's just a variety. But I would say a lot of times if people are if they have IFS or EMDR in their bio, kind of a thing, and then also just kind of talking with them and seeing if you feel safe. That's still one of the best correlations of success in therapies. If you feel like you and your therapist have a good teamwork, that's actually more important than what they do when they research out outcomes.
Absolutely. Yeah, like Michelle's saying here, it takes a lot to find the right therapist, and the foundation
Yes.
of trust are critical. And it sounds like it wasn't until her current that taught her the difference between CPTSD and PTSD that true healing began. I think that, and thank you for sharing that, Michelle. I think
Yeah.
that that is such an important point.
hmm Very, very true. And I think that complexity, once again, getting kind of into that subjectivity, I loved hearing Jennifer talking about bullying
Yes.
and getting to that stigma you mentioned. I still hear people of like my generation, you got like some of the Gen Xers, and stuff that still talk about like, well, bullying back then was just nothing, that's how they sound, that
Mhm.
voice. That's my impression of everyone who says that. Anyway, but I grew up in the East, guys. It's okay. But anyway, it's not an ethnicity. It's just a voice.
There you
So,
go.
but when we get that kind of stereotype of like, well, it's just bullying, people being people, kids being kids, kind of a mentality. And now we know that the interesting thing is people with a certain type of resilience might go through that experience of being bullied or having a car accident or even combat, and they don't show the symptoms of PTSD or complex PTSD. And then others will go through a similar experience and they will experience that. And so evaluating has to be individualized. That's a great point Michelle made, is learning the difference of how. I would even say, I'd go so far as to say it's important to evaluate how complex is my trauma, not just whether or not it is.
Mhm. Yes, yes.
And there's
And
a comment there, EFT, another emotionally focused therapy, and some of those tapping techniques very similar with EMDR. Sorry to jump on the comments there, but
oh
I just
yeah,
noticed that pop up.
yeah, absolutely. And yes, tapping. I think that's actually really interesting. Like I didn't know about it until recently. So there's like all sorts of just things that I feel like uh, I I I'm always trying to learn more because I don't have a psych background, but I feel like, or at least with all what I try to process through, like with just my trauma and all those things, like there's resources out there and there's more and more all the time, but it's having someone kind of sharing with us all of the information and finding the right therapist that you work with. And there's moving parts, but the work, if we put in the time and we kind of keep at it, I feel like it is worthwhile.
I think there is also an important thing to know, speaking of individualization and subjectivity. I would say don't be afraid to tell your therapist if something's not working for you.
Yeah.
Just because people talk about, I mean, let's take EMDR, for example. People talk about it and say it's, a wonderful thing. And there certainly is a lot of research to show that it does work, that it does impact trauma for a majority of people. That doesn't mean that it does for everyone. It also doesn't mean that everybody likes it
Mhm.
either. And if you don't, and it's not really working for you, speak up. I mean, because first of all, there's alternate ways. I mean, the most popular, thing that we think of when it comes to something like that is like the eye movement. But the eye movement is just one method of trying to do what you're trying to do. The other the other thing that's very interesting when we look at these different, especially modern and somatic techniques, we may know that they work. We don't really know why they work. There are theories about why they work. And I think when we get into that, it can be very fascinating. And, and this, by the way, is true for a lot of things. We don't always know how antidepressants work, for example. We just can observe that they do at a certain percentage for certain people. But we don't know for sure why they do. And that's okay. It's okay to just look at those outcomes and things. But that's where I think if we get into like this is something that don't break the spell, it's magic. It's not anything magical. It's so whether it's tapping or what they call parts work, where you have a dialogue internally, whether it's the bilateral stimulation, which is kind of that eye movement or tapping, um, whatever it's doing, they all seem to do something that is helpful. And finding what's right for you is so important.
Mhm.
Um, and to Michelle's point here, I think that I'm seeing is that we can't really prescribe to someone else, this is how you will recover. That's not, that doesn't usually help. Then we run the risk of accidentally weaponizing our experience instead of making it empathy.
Yes. Absolutely. I think that's such a great point. Yeah. Now, Dwight, can you tell us? I know last time we spoke on a summit, we talked about internal family systems, and you mentioned it briefly, but I think that's a really interesting kind of new topic that I recently started hearing about. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it's interesting. I came across IFS. The first time I ever even heard about it was when my own therapist pulled it out and
Mhm.
said, "We're going to work on this. We're going to do what she called parts work," and
Mhm.
that's a part of IFS. So think of it in this term like internal family systems. Family systems was developed. kind of obviously for literal families, and systems therapy looks at the communication of systems. And if you think about that, and then you think about the concept of an inner child, right, which most of us have, heard of and things, it's like saying, okay, let's take that to another level and say that the emotional responses we have aren't they're not just us. What they are is they are parts of us, as if we have a whole inner family going on. And part of this would assume, this theory would say that there is a core me, there's a self that's kind of deep in there. And a lot of IFS has to do with first learning this terminology about I'm relating to my parts, my emotional parts that will react and become activated by certain things, and oftentimes they are trauma coping responses that we learned at a young age. Learning that terminology and practicing talking about it differently. And then there are exercises where we essentially try to open a dialogue with this part. We're trying to disentangle from these parts. So an example of that terminology might be to say, I am afraid around crowds, right? That's what we would usually say, right? I have a social anxiety around people and crowds. In IFS, we would practice saying, like, there's a part of me that activates around crowds, or there is a part of me that tells me crowds aren't safe, or that doesn't want me to go around crowds, right?
Mhm.
And in a therapy session, so we practice that. I mean, that's just part of our thinking. If we think in terms, I'm already like differentiating between, like, there's something wrong with me. I don't like crowds. I must be and then we're looking internally to say, no, there's a part of me. And part of this theory behind it goes that this part actually cares about my health, my happiness, and my welfare. It doesn't hate me. It doesn't say sit at home and be miserable. It says sit at home and be miserable so that you're safer. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's
Yes.
a concept, right? That's important.
Mhm. No, I
And
think
then,
that's really
yeah.
interesting. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that in the therapy session, we might have a dialogue where we ask this part what it really is after, and we try to figure out what is the need that's driving this maybe unhealthy solution that this part is saying. But anyway, so I just wanted to round that out, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it's all very interesting and so many avenues, so many things that we can talk with our therapist about. And also, I think for me, it's just been helpful, like just to, I think you had said earlier, like, don't be afraid to like ask them, like, or talk to them about what you want or need. Like, I don't know, I sometimes have to practice being assertive with my therapist. Like, that's helpful for
Yeah.
me because sometimes that's scary. So it just finding the right person to work with about all of these things, whether that be internal family systems,
Mhm.
EMDR, or whatever that is. And Dwight, I love all the analogies you give. And I just want you to share with our audience. Well, there's two of them. I really like both of them. You talked about a seesaw, and I think that's such a great visualization. And I also want you, I don't know if everyone is familiar with the show The Simpsons, but I asked you in our podcast a while ago, what is your favorite Simpsons character? So I'm curious if I could ask you both.
Wow, am I going to give the same answer of The Simpsons? Now I got to remember what that was, but because anytime I give the favorite of anything, I kind of bounce around
Oh
a
yeah,
little
yeah.
bit.
Maybe favorite one day and
So we'll see.
not
Um, no, we'll see. So one of the things, though, you mentioned that I think the seesaw kind of teeter totter kind of thought process, something that was introduced to me a long time ago, was this concept of balance. And I
yes.
think when we talk about balance, we often make a mistake of talking about balance in terms of striking this perfect balance, right? That I have everything balanced in my life, meaning everything is kind of the same, and it kind of, but actual balance. And you think about kind of a seesaw, like on a playground, right? People go, you never really see kids sitting on one with the goal of keeping it exactly balanced, right? And never moving, right, at all. No, they want to go up and down, right? That's the goal. And if we're not going up and down, we're not really using the seesaw, if that makes sense. And
Hmm.
so,
Hmm.
so that is a very important idea of balance, is that balance will ebb and flow. And one of these things you can look at is, let's say that there's a sense of fun versus like security. So let's say we're working hard, right? We need a break when we're working hard. But let's say that we have nothing to do. If we have nothing to do for a long time, like a period of unemployment, then we would say, I'm worried because I have nothing to do. I need something that's going to make me feel productive and fulfilled. And particularly in a, say where income is important. So, there's different stressors if we are only on one of them. However, if you work really hard and never go on a vacation, or once again, if you're always not working, then it gets out of whack. So therefore, we should be working hard, taking breaks, working hard, taking breaks. That there's that's an example of a balanced approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, oh yeah, that Donald Trump's not going to be my favorite Simpsons character, but isn't that funny? Yes, there is. That is on one of this. I believe that's the episode where they flash forward in the future and Lisa takes over being president of the United States.
I remember that one. Yeah.
Oh, I'll say, and so while we're on that, I'm going to throw out. If it's all right, I'm going to mention two characters.
Sure.
There's a Lisa. Maybe I'm just thinking about it because she was president of the United States in that episode. But Lisa Simpson's very interesting. She shares in this one episode where Homer actually accidentally becomes intelligent. It doesn't matter the details, but anyway, he comes to her and he's like, I'm really smart, but I don't feel like I'm having as much fun, or I'm not enjoying my life as much. You're smart. Can you tell me? And she goes like, sometimes when intelligence goes up, happiness can go down. And then she's like, I made a graph about it. And then she just sighs and is like, I make a lot of graphs. Right. So there's this relationship. And then we're going to go to Homer, right, who is this kind of just like id character. If it feels good, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to do that. And so you can see a balance between these two. And I'll throw this out there. People can go back and try to find this. There's an episode where he and Lisa actually go through this, where he's trying to show her to be a little bit crazy in life. And she is obviously being very, very careful in life. And it's the episode where she wants to go to a museum and she takes the bus and gets lost. He has to find her. And then she says, I missed the museum. And he's like, well, let's break into the museum and go look at and so there's this kind of like back and forth balance. So maybe I'm just have that on my mind because of balance. So
I think
that's the answer today anyway.
Yeah, I think that's great with the balance. And I think that's a great point. And yeah, you said Homer in our podcast episode.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I thought. And that's, yeah. And when you look, I mean, I think one of the things about that character, when you go back and watch, is that generally speaking, and I haven't watched some of I think it's in its like 153rd year now. I think it's been going since the 1800s, but at least in the ones that I'm familiar with, let me just paraphrase. I don't know where they've gone in the last many seasons, but he generally was someone who wanted to do something good a lot of the time, or most of the time, means well, but then is overcome by selfish desires or other things, but then course corrects and really actually I think is much more of maybe every person than we might think when we just watch and say there's a big doofus that's funny to watch. So anyway.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think, yes. And again, going back to that balance, like there's times in life for things and times in life for other things. And I think that that's great. I absolutely love talking with you, Dwight. And I would love for you to share as we wrap up here, where our listeners, who's ever on the live here or on the replay, where they can find you. And thank you so much for everyone who's making comments. I truly appreciate you participating with us today in the summit.
Oh, I love, those the comments that you see pop up are just really great. And I appreciate that as well. I appreciate it on Valerie's behalf as someone who's done these kinds of events and trainings, but I also appreciate the content of those comments quite a bit as well. It's always nice to feel like we're just not up here totally on our own. And so I think kind of the best point of contact is my podcast is called The Broken Brain. And it's a podcast I've been doing since around 2014 or so with some pretty good regularity. There's a chunk of time in there where I had a little break for a while, but that's been a minute. And so people can check that out, and you can go to dwighthurst.com and click anywhere on there, or go to dwighthurst.com/podcast. That's a good point of reference, because on the website you'll kind of find all the different things from like individual therapy. I also try to post a lot of resources that are either free or lead to somewhere that's going to be free to low cost or whatever. And I'm always kind of using that as a launching. I'm always trying to add something new. I'm developing a kind of a DBT self-study course for people who just want to focus on their skill work,
Mm.
and been doing a lot with actual gameplay, and how like the use of games can actually help to shape social skills, to bond, and also doing some groups and experiments with group therapy that uses gameplay to process addiction, trauma. And so any of those kinds of things people would like to get into. And on the podcast, I interview a lot of clinicians. Valerie's been on there before, hopefully get you back on there again. And
Yes.
then a lot of creators and artists and filmmakers as well. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun.
Incredible. It's an incredible podcast. Definitely check it out. And it's available
Thank
on
you.
all major platforms, right? The Broken Brain.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, that's great. And I have all that in the show notes, so you guys can check it out afterwards for the replay. And thank you so much, Dwight, for joining us. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Yeah.
Just glad, really honored to be a part of it once again, and looking forward to even going back to some of the replays of the ones I haven't been able to see today. So thank you, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Well, have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.